In a post-apocalyptic world deprived of the structure and technology we've accustomed ourselves to, The Last of Us must rely on a wide variety of natural symbols in order to best represent the story it most wishes to tell. And while not even animals are safe from the infected's wrath, there are a handful of unique species that are repeatedly displayed throughout the game. While these creatures' exact meanings initially may appear dubious, upon closer inspection, the overwhelming majority of them are representative of the characters that you encounter and play as. So, without further ado, let's more closely inspect The Last of Us's animal symbolism, and how each animal ties into the character they represent. This is a video that will contain massive plot spoilers for The Last of Us 1 and 2 for my beloved show onlys, so consider yourself formally warned. To start off with, let's take a look at Joel, whose two animal symbols are a boar and moose. While both of these creatures seem to share a significant amount of traits in common with Joel and with each other, it's fairly important to note that the boar and moose are specifically reflections of how Ellie perceives Joel, and even more specifically, of how Ellie grows to perceive Joel after his passing. When The Last of Us originally released, there was a section in Ellie's journal in which she discussed hunting a boar, but being unable to go through with the final act of killing it because its screams reminded her of Joel's, with her instead leaving it to bleed out in the back of a gas station she tracked it to. However, this journal entry was originally imagined as a playable level, the likes of which can be examined in The Last of Us Remaster. In this level, Ellie is presented to the player cloaked in Joel's jacket, likely to seek out some comfort in her isolation and grief. But that being said, there's a noticeable heft to the jacket that hints while it may be an object of warmth and familiarity, it's also likely an object that's weighing her down as she attempts to secure her game. Both boars and moose are solitary animals that are highly territorial, extremely aggressive, and infamous for being extraordinarily difficult to kill. Boars specifically are known for desperately fighting until their final breaths, which is why in mythology, the act of slaying a boar is often framed as being a warrior's rite of passage. To view Joel as being akin to either a boar or moose suggests that Ellie perceived Joel as being virtually unkillable, only brought down by unnatural circumstances, underhanded tactics, and plain old bad luck. When Ellie is tracking her own boar, for a fleeting moment, Ellie feels as though she has suddenly been thrust into the same position as Joel's killers, only successfully incapacitating her quarry by cornering and confining it to an environment completely unnatural to it, through a cruel trick it had no way of steeling itself against or anticipating. The game even overlays Joel's screams on top of the boar's to hone in on how powerful this likeness is in Ellie's eyes. However, the scene that first comes to mind for me when viewing this is a scene that many audience members view as being the most upsetting Part 2 PTSD flashback. In this scene, Ellie has settled onto a farm with Dina and JJ, and is attempting to find and retrieve a lamb, a creature that cartoonishly embodies innocence and is viewed as being a harbinger of it. The lamb is evasive and crouched away in a shadowy corner, but there's nothing that feels inherently dangerous in this moment. The sun is setting, the light is filtering through the cracks in the barn, and JJ is strapped to Ellie's chest, suggesting a simple, quiet, and gentle domestic atmosphere. And yet, all it takes for this illusion to irreversibly shatter is for the lamb to balk and topple over a shovel, the sound eliciting the memory of Joel's head being forcibly bashed in. Although the lamb is not a creature any would argue embodies Joel's essence, it's one that, when combined with the boar, hones in on how dreary Ellie's circumstances are, with her being incapable of finding comfort in peace or in violence. Now on the other hand, while the moose doesn't trigger Ellie's PTSD in the fashion the lamb or the boar does, the moose still holds strong parallels. The moose is first encountered after Ellie and Dina's patrol sequence in Part 2, in which, after enjoying a relatively peaceful ride, the two stumble across the brutalized carcass of a moose, leading them to speculate on how the reason the carcass is in the state that it's in is due to it being torn apart by infected. At this image, Dina marvels at just how many infected it would take to bring down a moose. Another moose head later appears in the building that Joel is tortured in, but the most important moose appearance occurs during a flashback sequence in which Ellie is exploring a museum. The exhibited moose is being attacked by a pair of wolves, pinned in place by one that has deliberately crippled the right leg to mimic the way that Abby shoots Joel. While the imagery we're presented with is more than slightly on the nose, the wolf being the symbol of the Washington Liberation Front, it's a scene that showcases the regard Ellie holds for Joel's strength, him being a creature strong to the point that he can only be defeated by being set upon in a pack. Ellie also empathizes with the injustice of this setup, quietly urging the moose to stay strong. Yet at the same time, although Ellie openly empathizes with both the boar and the moose, these two animals could also be representative of her perception of the actions that Joel took to save her life, and the conflicted emotions that she has in regards to them, as they are both animals that frame Joel as being as much of a territorial destructive being as a protective one. There's even further irony here, because given Joel's aggression and ferocity, there are many that automatically would associate him with a predator, and yet he is likened to a prey animal known for its formidable strength. Moose specifically are notoriously at their most aggressive and dangerous when defending their young, framing Joel's maliciousness, at least in the eyes of Ellie, as defensive over explicitly offensive. The graffiti that can be found a short ways away further reiterates this idea, consisting of the ominous line, "I killed for them," a statement that could apply to both Abby and Joel. Abby is another character whose animal is more so a reflection of how Ellie perceives her over the way that she actually is, as such a key component of Abby's character arc is her shedding her wolf identity. The wolf in The Last of Us Part 2 serves as the mascot of the Washington Liberation Front, with all members of the organization being referred to as wolves. The Washington Liberation Front is first birthed from the crimes that Fedra commits against ordinary citizenry, with the wolf being adopted as the organization's sigil to contrast the meekness with which Fedra demanded they accept their mistreatment. Given these origins, most players may initially make the assumption the wolf is therefore intended to be a symbol of defiance, and while though it certainly may have begun as such, as the conflict between Fedra and the Washington Liberation Front escalates, the wolf morphs into a symbol of retribution. Even when Ellie is leading a lovely, peaceful life alongside Dina and JJ, the wolf still emerges as a symbol of Ellie's desire for revenge and retribution, with there being a wooden wolf carving positioned on top of Ellie's cabinet, showcasing how even when confronted with the very things the pursuit of vengeance will likely cost her, Ellie cannot bring herself to relinquish the idea of it. There is even further significance in the fact this is a piece specifically carved by Joel, allowing it to serve on the one hand as a reminder of the gentleness and creativity Joel was just as capable of, and on the other a haunting reminder of the people that stole the same man away. The wolf's elevated position on the shelf clearly shows what Ellie perceives to be her current hierarchy of needs, with her openly harboring the belief that her rage, grief, and guilt could be calmed in the event she earned her revenge. However, the very fact the wolf is carved indicates this is not a naturally born desire, but rather one stemming directly from another's cruelest actions. To Ellie, wolves are ravenous, animalistically cruel assailants, single-minded beings that move and strike as one united body. And it's for this exact reason that she's able to descend upon them with next to no remorse. And yet Abby, the wolf that Ellie most wants to catch, ultimately splits off from her pack. While fiercely loyal and devoted towards their family units, wolves, by nature, are so deeply social that some brand them inherently codependent creatures. And for Abby, the process of separating herself from her family and friends is every bit as agonizing, and yet essential to her personal growth and development, so that when you once again encounter her as Ellie, you see that she is not the frothing, inhuman monster you've made her out to be in your mind, but rather little more than a human being. When it comes to examining Ellie herself, it's worth noting the animals that are used to personify Ellie's innocence and the animals that grow to symbolize Ellie are extremely different. The first animal that comes to mind is the rabbit that she shoots in part 1, this being a somewhat infamous scene due to the general shock of watching such a cute animal meet such a violent end. There's even further significance to this rabbit specifically being a white rabbit over a common brown or gray one, as white rabbits are creatures automatically linked to childhood wonder and innocence, appearing in everything from whimsical fairy tales to Saturday morning cartoons. However, this notably isn't a pure white rabbit, with there being distinct tinges of gray around the ears that suggest this is merely a rabbit that happens to periodically turn white. Its perceived innocence is transient, impermanent, and subject to change in accordance with whatever form would best facilitate its survival, thus mirroring the predicament that Ellie grows to find herself in. While hardened by the harshness of the world around her, she still possesses a childlike sense of vigor and curiosity, and yet, at the same time, although the rabbit is a creature that sparks this innate sense of fondness, in order to survive, Ellie must kill it, much in the way she must suppress and eventually kill the softest, most vulnerable parts of herself, because this is the point of the story where she meets David. David, who taunts her and makes a mockery of her helplessness by calling her a little rabbit. In an ironic twist of fate, within this chapter, Ellie must experience the same thing her quarry did, having to hide and run from a malicious predator that longs to devour her. Similarly, in this same sequence, Ellie must track and kill a stag, the act of attempting to barter the stag's meat being the thing that puts her into contact with David in the first place. While does and fawns are, like the rabbit, traditional symbols of innocence and naivety, the stag, as a creature that annually sheds and regrows its antlers, is linked with rebirth. A stag's antlers typically shed between mid-January and early March, meaning that Ellie is tracking deer in the midst of this process that renders them vulnerable and disposes of their primary means of defense. However, the shedding of the old antlers is necessary in order for the stag to grow in the new, which are typically larger, stronger, and more physically imposing. Ellie's run-in with David serves a similar purpose, rendering her the most vulnerable she's ever been, and rebirthing her as someone more withdrawn, melancholic, and solemn. So while the rabbit is symbolic of Ellie's innocence and its subsequent destruction, the deer is emblematic of the pain of this transition. This pain is further reflected on in The Last of Us Part 2, with Ellie sketching out deer in her journal. In this same journal, she repeatedly attempts to sketch out Joel after his passing, but can't bring herself to draw his eyes, the stag that she draws similarly being the only other creature that has its eyes scribbled out, suggesting it's an image that invokes pain. In her later years, the moth becomes the creature that most prominently symbolizes Ellie. Not only does it appear on Joel's guitar, it's embedded into her skin, becoming a permanent fixture. While in the game, this moth tattoo is used in order to mask her bite. Symbolically, the moth parallels the firefly as a creature inherently drawn to light. However, there is an inherently destructive component to this desire, as moths are known to accidentally incinerate themselves in the process of pursuing it. Moths are also nocturnal animals that navigate the night and darkness. The designer of this tattoo has clarified the moth is specifically intended to be a Polyphemus moth, a moth named for the one-eyed Cyclops in Homer's Odyssey. It's worth noting that Polyphemus isn't characterized particularly kindly, being a belligerent, violent cannibal that forsakes the conventions of hospitality, and yet, at the same time, a being that bears impressive strength. Polyphemus is also blinded, and while the moth is not blind, it must navigate its surroundings with limited visibility, mirroring the main struggle Ellie must navigate throughout Part 2. After being blinded and thrust into the darkness, she must struggle again towards the light. However, it's also worth noting that light in this context may not quite necessarily implicate something positive, but more so something that spurs you onward. The moth imagery subtly implying that this thing is negative and will implicate self-destruction. This summarizes, in short, the crux of Ellie's Part 2 arc, with her struggling to strike a balance between her desire to cling to hope and craft a beautiful life for herself and her loved ones, and her obsession with evening the score. It's also worth noting how the moth symbolism ties into the firefly symbolism of the previous game, and the shift that marks in how Ellie is able to derive meaning and purpose. Fireflies are creatures best known for congregating in large groups and are capable of generating light from within, whereas moths are naturally solitary and incapable of doing the same. While Ellie starts life quite literally identifying as a firefly and is primarily driven by a sincere belief that she is capable of bringing tremendous positive change to the masses, as she ages, this ability diminishes. Not only must she grapple with the possibility that immunity will likely not be as instrumental in developing the cure as she had originally hoped, she must question whether or not humanity in of itself is worth saving at all. As her original sense of purpose is challenged and eroded away, she fails to find a new means of self-fulfillment, and instead seeks it out in other people. The moth is further viewed as being symbolic of Ellie and Joel's relationship, the being that links them together in terms of Ellie's tattoo and Joel's guitar. Each is necessary in order to prompt the other's rebirth, and neither can return to what they once were after having known each other. And yet, in relinquishing Joel's guitar, Ellie is able to relinquish the pain and guilt associated with his death, although she'll always carry a piece of him with her. There's one more animal heavily associated with the franchise that doesn't appear to be linked with any specific character at first, and that is the giraffe. However, closer inspection reveals that the giraffe is linked to a specific character, Sarah. Sarah has a large stuffed giraffe plush in her room, but even after her passing, we repeatedly encounter giraffes in areas heavily populated by children. A young girl in the Boston quarantine zone cradles one, and pictures are scattered throughout Egg Settlement, with them even being painted on the walls of the pediatrics unit. This imagery has always stuck out to me, because a giraffe, especially to a child, appears to be a ridiculous and borderline fantastical creature, the kind that truly ought to exist in the same realm as dragons and unicorns. And in a post-apocalyptic America, it may as well be. It's a creature no child born within this world should ever realistically be able to encounter, and yet it's one children appear to automatically gravitate to. It's not just a symbol of childhood wonder and whimsy. It embodies a gentle yearning for better times without the bitterness of the belief they will never come again. The encounter that Ellie and Joel have with the giraffe herd is to many the most impactful moment of the first game because of its sheer impossibility. It's the sort of thing that should have never been able to exist within the world that Ellie and Joel know, but it does. For one fleeting moment, the world is an innocent, magical place, filled with endless wonder and possibility. The giraffes providing a gentle reminder that all these qualities are still capable of existing, although the world that mankind once knew no longer does. Thank you for taking a tour of The Last of Us with us, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And here's an extra special thank you to our Patreons. What we do would not be possible without your support. If you would like to count yourself among them, the link is in the description. Thank you so much for your time, and have a fabulous day.